Hi, my name is Madeline Adams, and for my capstone presentation, I just decided to focus on theme number 1, which is theories of learning and their roles in teaching. And as I was creating my capstone project, I was guided by two main focus questions. The first being, how can teachers effectively support learners? And the second being, what teaching methods are beneficial to increasing student engagement and understanding? Now, as I was reflecting back on my teaching throughout my educational experience, I started to realize a pattern in the types of methods that I was using to engage and support my learners. And this pattern is what led me to create my competency statement, which says, I am competent at incorporating methods of explicit instruction to engage and support student learning. Now, as a means for clarification, when I say the words explicit instruction, I'm not referring to direct teaching. Instead, I'm referring to an instructional technique that is used to enhance student learning through motivation and scaffolding. And the methods of explicit instruction that I will reflect on through my capstone are actually from this text, Explicit Instruction, which was given to me by my cooperating teachers. Now, this is a book by Dr. Anita Archer and Charles A. Hughes. And I chose a quote from this book that I feel really represents my interpretation of explicit instruction and how I use it in my teaching. This quote says, explicit instruction is characterized by a series of supports or scaffolds whereby students are guided through the learning process. So moving into my first piece of evidence, I really wanted to go as far back into my program as I possibly could. So I chose a lesson plan from my very first practicum, where I was in a kindergarten classroom at Clinton Elementary School. Now, this lesson was a whole group reading lesson on animal habitats, but the part of the lesson I want to focus on is down here where I was reading the story Animal Homes to the students. And a few pages in, I actually asked the students to make a prediction. Well, as I was listening to the student responses, I started to realize that they were either completely irrelevant to the story or they were telling me facts instead of predictions. So as a teacher, I was able to assess that my students had no conceptual understanding of what making a prediction is and how to do it effectively. And that also told me that my students were really confused and disengaged throughout the entire lesson. So what did I learn from my first piece of evidence? Well, I found that when I was planning the lesson, I was so focused on content, what I was going to teach, that I really didn't think about the lesson delivery or what kinds of methods I would use to engage and support my students. So through this experience, I learned that my students needed a lot more engaging activities and a lot more support than what I had originally planned for. So reflecting on this lesson, it taught me that lesson delivery is an extremely important aspect and that I really needed to think about how I was going to engage and support my learners in future lessons. So moving to my second piece of evidence, I took this from my international teaching experience where I was an English camp tutor at Italian summer camps this past year. And so knowing that all of my students were going to be English language learners level 1, ages 5 and 6, I really had to think about how in the world I was going to take all of this academic content and make it applicable to their language and learning needs. So what I came up with was on the chalkboard every morning, I would display different words and phrases that I knew would be important for the students throughout the day. I would also ask the question, how are you today? And provide a sentence frame that says, I am blank, listing the options below. Now, in addition to this sentence frame, I would also include different frames depending on the content of the lesson. So, for example, this was my plan book through the summer, and right here I taught a lesson on like, and this was the sentence frame that I had done, yes, I like blank, or no, I do not like blank. So when my students came into the classroom, I would first have them partake in a listen and repeat callback activity where I would model how I would say the words and phrases and use the sentence frames, and then the students would repeat it back to me. Then I moved into an independent practice activity where I would ask a question such as, how are you today? And each individual student would respond using the sentence frame. So what did I learn from my second piece of evidence? Well, I found that the modeling was a very effective method of explicit instruction because it gave students an understanding of how to pronounce and use these words that they've never heard before. I also found that the sentence frames were very supportive as well because they gave students that foundation of language that they could then build on as they acquired new language skills. I found that my students were significantly more confident when they had first heard the words and phrases modeled and then had a sentence frame to support them throughout the conversations. So while the frames themselves were a really strong scaffold for my students' learning, I don't think that they were applied in the most effective way. I started to realize that the only opportunity my students actually had to practice the conversation skills using the sentence frames was when they independently answered me. And now while this student was answering me, I found that once again the rest of my students were disengaged. So overall, I grew from my first piece of evidence to my second in my ability to incorporate methods of explicit instructions to support my students' learning. However, I was still missing that engagement piece. So moving to my third piece of evidence, this I took from my student teaching where I was in a sheltered English classroom at Everett Elementary School. So sheltered English means that all of my students were third grade students, however, they were also English language learners levels 2 through 4. So once again, knowing that I was going to be teaching ELLs, I really thought about the delivery. How was I going to teach? What methods was I going to use in order to help them meet the objectives? So the lesson I chose was from a personal narrative unit, and this specific lesson had the objectives that students would be able to brainstorm ideas for personal narratives that they would write later on in the unit. So I started the lesson by giving the students a sentence frame, "A time when I was happy was blank." And then I had the students participate in 3 activities. So as you can see right here, I first modeled how the students would do a brainstorm of a think aloud. And then I modeled how the students would use the sentence frame with a pair share activity. And finally, I modeled how the students would record their ideas independently in their writer's notebook using caveman notes. So the students then partook in those 3 activities, and then I had them repeat the process, this time using the sentence frame, "Something special or fun I did with my family was." Now, as you can see, these 2 students were able to come up with numerous ideas for each sentence frame. So then I gave them the independent activity to go through and identify the 5 ideas that they thought would make the best personal narratives, and then write them on their watermelon seeds idea worksheet. So what did I learn from my third piece of evidence? Well, I found that once again, the sentence frames were a really strong method of explicit instruction because they supported my students by giving them a main idea, a focus point. I had found that in past units, my students had really struggled with writing because they just didn't know where to start. So these frames were supportive because they were general enough to elicit numerous responses. However, they were specific enough to give them a basic idea to think about. I also had grown from my second piece of evidence to my third by taking my sentence frames and making them more engaging by integrating them with another explicit instruction method, think, pair, share. So by combining the sentence frames and think, pair, share, the student engagement significantly increased, and every single student had the opportunity to practice the skill with support before having to do it independently. And finally, I found that modeling was an effective method of explicit instruction to support my students because it gave them the clear understanding and the confidence that they would be able to know what to do when it came time for independent practice. So as a result of intertwining all of these different methods of explicit instruction, every single one of my students was able to identify 5 ideas that they would use for their personal narrative. So moving into my synthesis, what were the big ideas that I learned? Well, number 1, I learned that effective teaching is a lot more than just content. Teachers need to consider how they're going to teach their students and what that delivery will look like. Number 2, teachers can't just explain a concept and expect students to comprehend it and apply it. They need that opportunity to see it modeled, practice it with support before they have to do it independently. And finally, I learned that student learning is most effective when multiple methods of explicit instruction are intertwined to not only support learners, but also engage them. So while I did just touch on the benefits that support and learning have on student engagement, I also realized that support really needs to come with a balance. As I talked about in my first lesson, my students, when they didn't have enough support, they were disengaged and confused. That being said, too much support wasn't good either because my students would be not challenged and they would become, yet again, disengaged. So the trick to using explicit instruction methods effectively is finding that way to engage learners by providing just enough support. The limitation is that finding that just enough support is difficult to find. So reflection, how have I grown? Well, I began my educational journey not recognizing the importance of lesson delivery and incorporating no methods of explicit instruction. Towards the middle of my program, I was now able to incorporate different methods of support, but I still was struggling with that engagement piece. And now finally, by the end of my program, I know that I'm able to consistently integrate multiple methods of explicit instruction to effectively engage and support my learners. But what do I still need to learn? Well, I'm still trying to find that process of just what just enough support looks like. And I know that this will be different for every group of students and every individual student that I teach. So this is an aspect where I will be constantly learning and growing throughout my professional career. Now, to help me grow, I can collaborate with teachers and colleagues and research alternative methods, but I can also push myself in my classroom to take risks and experiment with different levels of support. This will really help me identify what methods of explicit instruction I can use to engage and support every learner in my classroom. Thanks for listening.